Hello everybody and welcome to Vietnam Talk. I'm Brian, yours from Far Founded, and today I have a very pleasure to announce that we have a very special guest today. His name is Jim Laurie, and Jim Laurie is a journalist, news reporter, and much more. And Jim spent his time in the Vietnam conflict. He went to Vietnam, he went to Cambodia, he saw a lot of battles over there. But not only that, he was among the few Americans who went on a helicopter when the U.S. left Cambodia on the 12th of April 1975 during the Eagle Pool. And he was among the last Americans who left Saigon on April 1975 under the Operation Frequent Wind. And Jim was among the first Americans who came back to Vietnam in 1979 and went with the Vietnamese army into Cambodia to see what happened with the Khemer Rouge and the genocide. And for a person like me, Jim was among the first American who met the Amerasians in Vietnam. He actually did a small film, and that way that the American public became aware of the Amerasians who were still in Vietnam. And for me, Jim is a very special person because he's among the few living person who can remember a time during the war, and I'm so pleased that I'm having here, and I really hope you can enjoy the interview I had with Jim. And please follow up on this on our YouTube channel on Father Founded, and don't forget to subscribe and send us comments, good or bad. Okay, Jim. First of all, welcome to Vietnam Talk, and wow. I can't imagine having you here because it's something I'm really trying for a long time to get a person like you coming here. So Jim, please tell me about who are you and what is your story, because you had an amazing story.
Well, thank you, Brian. Yeah, my history goes back a long way with Vietnam. I first arrived in Vietnam as a young freelance reporter. I was 22 years old. And I arrived in Saigon in 1970, and within 1 month I was in Cambodia, working in Cambodia. I was then a freelance reporter. I worked for some newspapers. I worked for a magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review. And I did a lot of radio reporting in those days for small American radio stations. And I got my first introduction to the war in 1970, covered both Cambodia and Vietnam. 1970, 1971, 1972, left for a while, and then I came back to Cambodia and Vietnam in 1975. First, I went to Cambodia, where I had a wonderful girlfriend who I was trying to get back together with in 1975. And my Khmer girlfriend, she didn't want to leave. She didn't want to leave Cambodia, despite all the warning signs that the Khemer Rouge were a radical communist movement that would come in and take over the country. And clearly the Americans were not providing the support that they used to provide. And the Lon Nol regime in 1975 was on its last legs, if you will. And I've written a book, of course, about my relationship with Sok Sinam, the Khmer girl who I knew. And my book details her story and my story in Cambodia and in Vietnam. So I'll leave that to people to maybe read my book on that. Buy a copy of my book would be good. But what happened then was my relationship with Vietnam continued long after the war. I was originally a China studies student, but in the 1970s, I could not get into China. I simply could not get any visas for China. So I needed some money. And so I went to Vietnam and Cambodia and to earn some money and to witness the war and I got very much involved with the people in Cambodia and Vietnam. I didn't expect to, because I didn't know very much about Vietnam and Cambodia. I was very much a young person in his 20s learning about these countries. So in 1975, when Cambodia was falling, the American embassy pulled out of Phnom Penh, and I went out on the helicopters with the American ambassador. I was hoping to take my friend Sok Sinan out on those helicopters. Sadly, We weren't able to make the evacuation with her, so she stayed behind and I left. From Cambodia, I went on to Vietnam, arriving in Vietnam only less than a week before the collapse of Saigon and the American evacuation of Saigon. But I had decided with a friend of mine, a friend named Neil Davis, an Australian guy who was a wonderful journalist and a great cameraman, we had decided not to go on the evacuation. We wanted to stay and witness the final moments of the war. And we knew that Saigon would surrender to the communists because the Americans had pulled out all of their support. It was only a matter of time because the South Vietnamese were losing badly as the North Vietnamese had launched a very strong three-pronged offensive all across the country. So we waited, and Neil and I witnessed the last American helicopter to leave the U.S. Embassy on the early morning, about 8 a.m. of April 30th, 1975. And so we saw the last of the Americans leave, and we stayed on. We thought that we would be safe because we knew that the communists from Hanoi were pretty sophisticated in their handling of media, their handling of journalism. So we stayed on and we met with the newly installed North Vietnamese leaders, and I was able to stay, and we kept filming for NBC TV by this time. We worked for American NBC, and we kept filming the North Vietnamese who began to take over the city bit by bit between May 1st and May 26th. And I had to leave on May 26th because the Vietnamese said, if you'd like to have your film seen by the outside world, you're going to have to leave with your film, Mr. Laurie. So they
sure.
They took me out to the airport, put me on a plane to Vientiane, Laos, and then from Laos to Thailand, and Thailand to Hong Kong, where we got out all of our film, nearly a 1 month worth of film. In those days, of course, we didn't have satellites or Skype or instantaneous communications. Everything was on film, and it took days to get, content out to the outside world. But we had a major scoop on our hands because we had some of the only film of the fall of Saigon and the North Vietnamese bit by bit establishing their presence in Saigon. So that was perhaps the biggest story, or one of the biggest stories that I had in my journalism career. I always wanted to go back to Vietnam and always wanted to go back to Cambodia because I wanted to find my girlfriend in Cambodia. Mm-hmm. It took me 4 years before I finally got permission from the North Vietnamese to return to Vietnam and Cambodia. By this time, Vietnam had invaded Pol Pot's Cambodia, expelled the Khmer Rouge, and had taken over in January 1979, essentially putting in their own people, the government of Cambodia. And so through the Vietnamese, I was able to get a visa for Vietnam and Cambodia in April of 1979. So I returned both to Vietnam and Cambodia in that year.
That must be wise.
And then later that year, I went back again. So I went back twice on 2 fairly long visits to Vietnam and Cambodia, one beginning in April and the other that began in November of 1979. And I was in there until early 1980. So those were amazing times for me because I was one of the first reporters to get back into Vietnam and Cambodia after Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, was overthrown,
it's
and
like
then Vietnam.
Killing fields, right? See the killing fields.
So I was a witness just after the killing fields because we were taken all across Cambodia to a lot of mass graves. We saw the mass graves in the western part of Cambodia, in areas several kilometers outside of Phnom Penh. We were among the first journalists to visit the Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh, where many, 21 was the number for it, where many people were tortured and executed in that Tuol Sleng prison. So it was quite extraordinary being in Vietnam and Cambodia at that time. And the best part about it is, finally, at the end of 1979, I was reunited with my girlfriend from Cambodia. She had managed to survive the 4 years of the Khemer Rouge regime on a small work camp about 20 miles southwest of Phnom Penh. And I was able in 1980 to get her out of Cambodia finally, a promise that I had made nearly 10 years before, and I finally did that. So Vietnam and Cambodia became almost a place of regular visits for me. After 1980, I went back frequently to Vietnam and Cambodia, and I first came in contact with the children of dust, if you will, the Amerasians, in the early 1980s. It's funny, back in 1979, when I first went back to Vietnam, mind you, it was very, very hard between 1975 and 1978 to get a visa. So very few journalists could get a visa to communist Vietnam in that period. So I was among the first to be able to get visas for Vietnam. And in the 1980s, it became apparent that there were many children, the product of American GIs and Vietnamese women, who had been left behind, usually, obviously, without fathers, sometimes without even their mothers. They were left behind in Saigon. And I discovered that there must have been at least 30 or 40 street children. By this time, most of them were born in the early 1970s. Mm-hmm. So by the time I met them, they were like 12, 13, 14 years of age.
Wow.
And most of them were living on the street, living rough in Saigon. Most of them were abused by unscrupulous mafia-type Vietnamese organizations. Mm-hmm. Many of them had no money at all. They just lived on handouts. Wow. Many of them were beggars. And some of them were extraordinarily beautiful children. And I resolved, I didn't understand at the time, why was it that the Americans were not being generous and giving these half-American kids visas for the States? They certainly should be doing that. But I found that the American bureaucracy was working very, very, very slowly, and very little was being done for these Amerasians. I would be told by the American officials over in Bangkok, because at this time there was no.
They had the office in Bangkok. They already did the office.
The only place that I could meet the Americans was in Bangkok, because there were no American diplomats in Vietnam at this time, throughout the early 1980s when I'm going into Vietnam. So I said to the Americans, I said, what are you doing about the Amerasians? And they said, well, we have to follow procedures. We're examining their papers. Well, I said, you realize that most of these kids that I meet on the streets of Saigon, they have no papers. They don't have documentation. What are you waiting for? They're never going to be able to produce documentation. Birth. I mean, these are illegitimate children of liaisons between American soldiers and Vietnamese women. And their passport ought to be their face. That's how you can tell, because you can tell right away that they're half American. That ought to be your only criteria. There was one particular young woman who I met her in 1985, I believe it was, on the streets of Saigon, and her name was Kim. And I called the American Embassy's attention to her, among others, and based upon her face, she finally got out. The Americans, by 1990, 5 years later, the Americans had finally, they woke up. They realized that they were going to have to take care of the Amerasians, even though these kids had no paperwork. Sure. So most of them who wanted to go, all of the street children that I knew, got out between 1985 and 1991. When I went back again to Vietnam in the 1990s, and I went back several times, 92, 95, different years. Most of them were all gone by that time, which was great. And I don't know if you're interested, but I can send you, Brian, an article that I did, which was featured in 2017, on something called the Huffington Post. The title is Vietnam, A Tale of Miss Saigon, The Children of Dust. And it's a profile. It's a profile of the woman that I had first met in 1985, and she ended up living in California, and I think she's now living in Massachusetts. But I'll send you this story. I've got pictures of the young girl who I met on the streets of Saigon, and I have a picture of her and all of her. She now has children and grandchildren. She's she's very much grown up, and she's living in America. So I'll send this article to you. You may be interested to read it or post it.
I appreciate it.
So basically, that is my story.
Yeah, can I have a question for you, Jim?
Sure.
You went to Cambodia, you went to Vietnam, and you left Cambodia, you left Vietnam when the fall of Phnom Penh and fall of Saigon. Was it different when you left Cambodia and you left Vietnam? I mean, in Cambodia, very few people got evacuated because Cambodians didn't like to leave the country. While the Vietnamese knew if they didn't left Vietnam, they would end up getting killed or something worse.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, what is interesting and also very, very sad is that the Khmer and the Vietnamese had a very different attitude towards the war and towards death, in fact. The Khmer, with their very deep-rooted Buddhist faith, I think were both fatalists, but also a bit naive. They did not believe the reports, and most of these reports were Western reports, of how bad the Khemer Rouge were. They did not believe that they could not talk to fellow Khmer and work out some kind of solution.
Yeah.
So so I left on these helicopters, and there were more than 100 empty seats that were there for Khmer, Cambodians, including my girlfriend, who did not leave. So that is very tragic for them, because the end of the war in Cambodia, a 5-year war, was much, much worse than anybody predicted. Whereas in Vietnam, the war had gone on, of course, much, much longer. There were tens of thousands of Vietnamese in Vietnam who had very close ties to the Americans. Yeah. The Americans managed in those first days to get maybe 8,000 to 10,000 Vietnamese out of the country in those last days of April. The Vietnamese wanted very much to get out because they felt that they had such close ties to the Americans that their lives would also be in jeopardy. The irony is, although many tens of thousands of Vietnamese went to re-education camps and many died, it was not nearly as bad as the experience of Khmer next door to Cambodia. The Vietnamese communists pursued a harsh policy, but not deadly policy, not the extreme radical policy of the Khemer Rouge communists. The re-education camps was the worst of what Vietnamese experienced, and many, of course, were put in re-education camps in Vietnam. Some of them were there for like 10, 15, sometimes 20 years before they were finally released. And many of them died in those re-education camps. But having said that, the fears of the Vietnamese were understated, and the fears, were overstated, and the fears of the Khmer were understated. So it was a very different contrast between Vietnamese mentality and Cambodian mentality.
But you know what? Once I was in Vietnam, they had a very famous photo of the helicopter who was taking off from the roof in Saigon. I think it's a UE helicopter from Air America. It's going down on the roof. There's a ladder, and people are climbing up. And this place used people who work for the Vietnamese political and people who work for the South Vietnamese intelligence service. You know, the Truman building.
That building, which is still standing, by the way.
Yeah.
If you go to Saigon,
there.
you can still visit that building. It's one of the few buildings that has not been torn down in Saigon. That building housed a number of operatives of the American CIA. It was where they lived, and it was located approximately 5, 6, maybe 10 city blocks away from the American embassy. And it was a civilian pilot in a CIA helicopter that went over to rescue a few of his friends. And then, of course, the helicopter was filled up very quickly by lots of Vietnamese on that roof who wanted to leave. And my friend Hugh Van Ness, who is a Dutch photographer, he's now passed away, but Hugh Van Ness took that famous picture of the helicopter there.
Wow. But, you know, I went up on the rooftop by accident. I found out where the place is. I took a Vietnamese friend with me. He gave a little bit of money, went up on the roof, and you still had the old ladder, and you still had this on the top, and you still had the feeling of looking up and imagine the helicopters just almost landing, but it doesn't stop on the engine. It's just hovering. And the guy who is the helicopter pilot, something says he's blind on one eye and he can't use his leg, but he's still doing his job. And that's just a wild, crazy story. Is that true story or what is it?
No, that's true. It's true story. There's a book called Decent Interval by a man named Frank Snepp, and he tells that story. He tells that story in detail in his book.
Wow. But it's like this. How do you compare Vietnam and Cambodia today and during that time? I mean, it changed a lot. I mean, when you came back there.
I mean, basically, I was last back in Cambodia and Vietnam in late 2019, before the pandemic. I haven't been anywhere, frankly, in Asia since the pandemic. I've been to Europe, but I haven't been to Asia. But what happened? It's interesting. Vietnam, it stayed almost the same from 1975 until 1988-89. Very, very few changes. Then, beginning in the 1990s, Vietnam began to change. The communist government changed. The hardline communist, a man named Le Duan, he died in 1988, I believe. And after he died, I would say more reformist communists began to take power in Hanoi. And as they did, they used the Chinese model for reform of the economy. They opened up the economy to private enterprise. And so private enterprise, as soon as it was permitted, just blossomed up and down Vietnam, both in the north and the south. The south is always the juggernaut of the Vietnamese economy. They were always much more vibrant, much more active, much more workaholics, if you will. So you see changes year by year, beginning in roughly 1992, 1993 in Ho Chi Minh City. And then every year it gets more and more. The foreign direct investment comes in, the building, all kinds of new buildings, both in Hanoi and in Ho Chi Minh City. And you see the economy grow. It's interesting. The World Bank yesterday reported that Vietnam was the fastest growing Asian country. And they said that the only country in Vietnam where during this pandemic period has been going up is Vietnam. Wow. And the overall depression of the Asian economy is due to China. China's been going down, Vietnam going up. A lot of companies, of course, are removing their investments from China and putting their investments in Vietnam. So Vietnam has been on a very fast-paced growth for the last 20 years or more. Cambodia is recently even faster. I was shocked by Phnom Penh when I was there in 2019 by the number of new skyscrapers. The difference is that Cambodia has a much lower income base. The disparity between the very, very rich and the very, very poor in Cambodia is much greater. There are Hun Sen, the longtime prime minister of Cambodia, and his family and all their friends at the very top of this income pyramid. And then moment that you drive out to the countryside, you find tremendous poverty in Cambodia. So there's much more inequality in Cambodia, it seems to me. And the other issue is that in Vietnam, the investment comes from everywhere. Comes from Europe, comes from America, France, China, Russia, everywhere. Whereas Cambodia has become very much dependent on China. And I would say the lion's share of investment in Cambodia is from China. Whereas Vietnam has got a lot of Taiwan investment. They've got South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia. It's much more diverse in Vietnam. So that's how I would compare the two countries.
But you know something, Jim, I know you're probably going to leave soon, but anyway, I had one last question. Something's really interests me about Vietnam. I think you have the same feelings. If you go around in the US, recently I went to the Texas, Houston. I met one Amerasian woman. I helped her and the family to come to the US in about 4 years ago, and I came to meet her and the children. It was wonderful. It was amazing. Where are we going? We're going to Little Saigon. We had Little Saigon everywhere. We had the old South Vietnamese flag, which in Vietnam is you don't show that flag, is forbidden. But it's so interesting to see you had two different kinds of Vietnam. You had one Vietnam in Vietnam, then you had all the Vietnamese who went after the 30th of April 1975 to the US and Europe, Australia, and keep the old tradition. It's like it's two different countries, it's two different people.
That's true. You're true. I live in. Obviously, the biggest Little Saigon is in California. Most Vietnamese who came to America, they settled either in California or Texas. Yeah. So those are two big areas of these immigration. But you go to Orange County, California, and the Vietnam town is enormous. Mm-hmm. And you're right. Here in Washington, D.C., we have a little place just outside of Washington, D.C. called Falls Church, Virginia. And there is a Vietnam town there as well. They call it the Eden Center. Eden is one of the famous old apartment buildings in Saigon, and they've renamed it Eden Center out in Virginia. And they also fly the old Vietnamese flag every year. On April the 30th, they have a ceremony.
Memorial.
They don't call it the Liberation Day. They call it April 30th, 1975, the Day of Shame. And that is the Day of Shame. And that's what they call it out there in Virginia. And the people there it's funny. The young people, of course, go back and forth to Vietnam. They travel all the time to Vietnam. But some of the old people are pretty set in their ways. Some of them go back to Vietnam. But when they come back to America, they revert back into the pre-1975 world. Wow.
Jim, I want to see you back on this show again because you and me have so much to talk about, and you're such an amazing person, an amazing character. And like I say, you're among the few still left on this time in Vietnam, because all the other people who went there as a journalist, news reporter, they're getting old, they're passing away. You have so many names, so many people, and I can't thank you enough for being here and take your time with me.
Well, you're most welcome. I'm going to have to run now, but what I will do, Brian, is I will send you that article about the Amerasians I met in Vietnam, and feel free to reach out to me again email is. I'm always on email. I'm not on Facebook all the time. I go on, so maybe once a week I go on Facebook. So I'm not there often. So email is much easier for me.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I appreciate you coming here. And have a nice day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Same to you. Bye-bye.